All right. I'm delighted to introduce tonight's presenter. James H. Cox is the Jane and Roland Blumberg Centennial Professor of English at the University of Texas at Austin. His primary research interests include 20th and 21st century American literature, especially Native American and immigration literature. He's published 4 books on Native American literature and co-edited the Oxford Handbook of Indigenous American Literature. He is also a highly respected and decorated teacher. He's won 4 teaching awards, and he was inducted into the Academy of American of Distinguished Teachers in 2017. We've also been so fortunate to have him present at a number of Humanities Texas teacher programs over the years, both in person and online. And we are delighted to have him back tonight. Please help me welcome Dr. Cox.
All right. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thanks everyone for coming this evening. I'm going to repeat something that Elizabeth just said. She thanked you for your teaching. I'm going to thank you for your teaching too. I come from a family of teachers. I mean, half my family are teachers. I'm thinking in particular about my younger sister, who's a reading specialist in elementary school. But we have teachers all across the education landscape. So in some ways, this is the happiest place I could be at 5 o'clock in the evening. I know you all had a long day and you chose to be here, and I appreciate that. And so, with without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and start the presentation. I am planning to make it interactive too. I'll have some questions for you that I invite you to to share your thoughts about here and there throughout the presentation. And you're also welcome to post questions into the chat. I'll try to keep my eye on that. And I think Elizabeth and or Emily might also help me to do that. So kind of bigger picture, tonight will primarily be about context and the big picture Native American literary history. And then next week, we'll have a more focused conversation on some specific texts that I will share with you in the presentation today, and then we'll make them available to you as well. So let me attempt to share my screen here. And there we go. Everybody can see it okay? Yes, yes. Okay, okay, fantastic. So one of the I wanted to start in this particular place. I wanted to start with part of a poem by one of the most celebrated Native American writers, Louise Erdrich. She's Turtle Mountain Ojibwe from Minnesota. I imagine everybody's heard her name. She is a prolific novelist. Before she became a novelist, she was also a poet. She writes for young readers as well. And I wanted to start with one of her most well-known and often taught poems called Dear John Wayne, because for me, it sets up one of the trickiest parts of teaching Native American literature, because there are so many assumptions and so much lack of knowledge about Native Americans and Native American communities, Native American people and culture and religions and so on. Because there's so many assumptions about that, one of the things that I think it's really important to do right at the beginning, if you're going to do a unit on Native American literature, is remind your students right at the beginning that Native Americans are modern people living in the modern world. They have inherited many distinct traditions, beliefs, and cultural practices, but they also go to the drive-in movie theater, or at least they did when we used to have drive-in movie theaters, at the very least. And they watch TV and go to the grocery store, and do all the other things that people who are not Native American do. And I just thought this particular set of stanzas from Louise Erdrich's poem, Dear John Wayne, captures that. And so this is what Erdrich says here. August and the drive-in picture is packed. We lounge on the hood of the Pontiac, surrounded by the slow-burning spirals they sell at the window to vanquish the hordes of mosquitoes. Nothing works. They break through the smoke screen for blood. Always the lookout spots the Indian first. Spread north to south, barring progress. The Sioux or some other planes bunch in spectacular columns, ICBM missiles, feathers bristling in the meaningful sunset. And so here you have, Erdrich inviting us onto a reservation to a drive-in movie theater where you have a group of Native people watching a John Wayne Western. So the scene itself suggests the way that Native people, again, fully participate in the modern world, and at the same time are in a position where it's necessary for them to contend with particular assumptions about and stereotypes of them, right? And one of the ways in the middle of the 20th century that these were easily perpetuated was through Hollywood films, specifically Hollywood Westerns, in which Native people often appeared just over the horizon in a threatening or menacing manner, and then, as you all know, attacked, for example, a wagon train or a settlement of white immigrants to the West. There's also a lot of really clever stuff going on in these stanzas with the reference to Pontiac. So this is the name of a car, but the name of the car derives from a native leader of the Odawas or Ottawas. And that's just like you get all kinds of vehicles named after Native people, you also get them named after tribes and so on. So that's a kind of a clever reference there as well. So in any case, you notice in those last two lines how she combines the image of the ICBM missiles. Remember, this poem is from 1984, so this is nearing the end of the Cold War. ICBM missiles, many of which are placed in the West, near native land, native communities, native reservations, and sort of blends that particular image with the feathers in the headdresses that in Hollywood Westerns, Native people always wore, even though in real life they're ceremonial. So in any case, that seems to me to be a really good place to start. It's sort of starting in the middle, I realize, but it's a way from the very beginning to remind students that Native people are not stuck in the past, are not stuck in the 19th century, for example, which is the most common era in which they are depicted. So one of the other things that I do with my students when I'm teaching a Native Lit class and trying to get some sense of what they know or don't know about Native American life, Native American people, and Native American communities, et cetera, is I ask them some version of this particular question that you see here on the screen. And so the question is, what do you know, or what do you think you know about Native Americans? And the goal here is to get those assumptions and beliefs and stereotypes and so on out in the open at the very beginning. So you can get the students, to refocus, on what it is you're really going to present to them, or right, like you're going to present to them self-representations by Native writers. You can share with them historical facts, give them some context, like I'm going to share with you. And it's also a way I've found um, to kind of establish the groundwork for future projects. I've, at least in my experience, I've found that students actually like to be disabused of misinformation, right? They say, I believe this, but in fact, this was the case when it comes to, for example, Native American casinos or something like that. And so this is usually at the foundation, either for a unit on Native Americans or for an entire class on Native Americans. But it often becomes the genesis of some sort of long-term kind of inquiry that my students will do. I shared a couple resources there with you. One is called American Indian Stereotypes and Realities. It's from 1996. And then there's a more recent one by Anton Troyer called Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians But Were Afraid to Ask. Troyer actually published a version of this for younger readers. It's actually probably, because my understanding is you're mostly high school teachers, is that correct? Yeah? High school? Yeah. Okay, so in any case, this is for middle school readers, but there are two versions of this particular book, and both of these books provide really good foundation and background, for a discussion of Native people. There are variations on this. There are all kinds of ways that you can ask, this particular question. Here's another variation of it that I use sometimes. Where do you see, encounter, news or information or references to Native American people and culture? And so a lot of times the students will say things like, yeah, I saw a TV show or I saw a film or something like that. And that's also a way into the conversation. I was actually thinking that we could actually do this for at least a minute or two, ourselves. So I would invite you to put something in the chat, to put comments in the chat, from your own perspective. Where, for example, do you see or encounter news, information about references to Native American people and culture? In part, what I'm asking here is where do you learn about them, right? Because we're trying to set up a unit where we'll only be reading Native American authors. They'll be talking about their own experiences, either in fiction or in poetry or in drama or something like that. And so what we want to do is kind of talk about the different kinds of sources of information that we have. So I want to invite you to drop something into the chat, and I will try to answer or respond to those questions. I do see that there's a middle school teacher here now, 11th grade American Lit, 9th grade English. Is anyone interested in dropping something in there about just like where do you see Native people on a daily or a weekly basis, or do you not see them at all? Too, I get information from my tribe, right? So Creek, thank you, Natasha. When you get information from your tribe, where do you get it? Do you get a newspaper? Or I mean, when I say newspaper, I'm thinking also like online. Is there an online news source? One of the resources that you can all use when you're doing units on Native Americans is the Tribal National resources. Actually, a lot of them have resources specifically for teachers, more creation stories. We have an app and weekly emails plus social media. That's great. All online or written sources, okay. In Sioux Falls, they're closer for rich and okay. In Sioux Falls, right, news stories usually too, okay, good. Shauna, when you say news stories, where are you seeing those news stories? Yeah, various nations' websites, that's really good. That's a good place to go to. CNN, NPR, okay, yeah, good, excellent. Social media too, okay. Excellent. So I think that okay, so I think what's really interesting about that would be you have sort of all those sources, and then See, now I know you won't have time for this because you're all nearing the end of the semester like I am, and you can't just like do something right, like tangential with whatever lessons plans you have in place. But it would be really interesting to hear what your students say and see if it's different, right? To see where they're getting it and to dig down into it a little bit, particularly if they say social media, like what social media exactly are they using to get their information. And so what you can do then once you have collected those sources of information, you can have a discussion with your students about which ones are good sources of information and which ones, perhaps they would do better not to consult. So again, that's just one variant of this particular question. What do you know? What do you think you know about Native people? And again, it's I think I've found over many years of teaching that it's a really good conversation starter. So um, let me move to terms, and then I'm going to uh, be sure to stop and see if you have any questions about the terms here too. And so I include this at the beginning of this presentation because this is a question that I always get. It's always a kind of a first day of a Native American Lit class question. What terms can we use? What terms do Native people like, prefer, and so on. And the answer that I give my students is it depends, and it's different for every Native person. Some people like Native American, some people don't. Native people, I mean, American Indian is actually in more common usage than people think. It was never entirely replaced by Native American. Indigenous is becoming a little bit more common in the United States, even though it's used in other countries with more frequency. And then First Nations is one that is used in Canada. And so there's another exercise here for your students. You can ask them to research one of the currently 574 tribal nations in the US or one of the numerous indigenous groups in Canada and Mexico. And the reason that I would suggest this is it's a really good reminder for your students that each one of these tribal nations and sometimes even groups within them are distinct, have distinct histories, have had distinct histories before Europeans arrived in the hemisphere, and had distinct histories afterwards. And so getting students to gain a modicum of expertise on one group, during your unit, it can, I think, empower them to do research and also to teach. It gives everyone in the group an opportunity to teach other people in the group. Tribal nation used to name those indigenous communities that are recognized as such by the US federal government. So that's what, when you hear like the Cherokee Nation, for example, or the Seminole Nation, Potawatomi Nation, right? In almost every case, it's because they have federal recognition. They're recognized by the federal government as Native. People have citizenship in tribal nations. This is important too. You want to just tell your students, at the beginning of a conversation, that yes, you can say that Native people belong to a tribal nation, but it's more appropriate and precise to say that they're citizens of the tribal nation. Each tribal nation has a different criteria for citizenship. It varies widely, really widely, but they do have criteria that has to be met. in some cases, tribal nations and the federal government will use CDIB cards, Certificate of Degree of Indian Blood. We don't, unless you want to talk about this, I don't think we need to. But it's also a very, very vexed way to identify people by their blood quantum. But there are tribal citizens of tribal nations who have this card, in part because there was some criteria to have a certain amount of native ancestry, tribally specific native ancestry. Intertribal is an important word also. It means exactly what it suggests, that there are multiple tribes engaged in something together. There are intertribal contexts. Something like the Sundance in the 19th century, this was a massive intertribal gathering of people on the Great Plains in the middle of the summer for this big social event and ceremony. It's intertribal. That is, multiple tribes were engaged in it while maintaining their distinct identities. And then pantribal is a word that's fallen a little bit out of favor, in part because it suggests commonalities between all tribal nations, that it would be really difficult to actually prove, right? That they're all the same in one way or another. That doesn't mean that there aren't pan-tribal organizations. There are, but there are also intertribal organizations as well. One of the earliest pan-tribal organizations was called the Society of American Indians. It was founded in 1911. And only lasted for about 13 or 14 years, actually. Well, I don't need to tell the story about why it didn't last any longer than that. But intertribal, different than pan-tribal. Intertribal just means maintaining strong distinctions between, say, Arapahoes and Muskogees, or between Salish people and Chickasaws. So I'm going to stop there for just a second and glance at the chat to see if there are any questions about any of those terms. It doesn't. I'll keep an eye on it, but right at the moment it doesn't seem like any are popping up. Let's see. So let me move on a little bit. We are still in introductory mode. In addition to talking about those important terms, I like at the beginning of a unit to talk with my students about the different ways that Indigenous people communicated with each other without alphabetic languages. And so I think that if you hear that a group doesn't have a written language, you might be, and by you I mean your students might be predisposed, to assume certain things about that group, right? Since writing itself is a sign in a lot of parts of the world of a particular kind of culture and social organization, and even, I'm gonna put this word in quotes, civilization. So one of the things that I think it's important to do is to talk a little bit, you don't have to be experts on this, but to talk a little bit about the different ways that Native people recorded their stories, recorded stories about themselves, recorded stories about their communities, oftentimes recorded stories about interactions between themselves and other Indigenous communities, kept track of their histories. This is Newspaper Rock. It's an amazing rock face full of petroglyphs, some of which are 2,000 years old, and some of which are much more recent, even post-contact. There were um, codexes in Mesoamerica too, folding books as well. This is one of the ones that survived Spanish colonization. It's called the Dresden Codex. The codexes are usually named by the place where they reside, the place where they were taken from Mesoamerica. This one is obviously, in Dresden. Two wampum belts. This is one from 1794. It's a treaty belt that tells a story about an agreement made between two different groups. This is a winter count, one of the more famous winter counts. Each one of those images is a year. This runs for 71 years. It's called the Long Dog, not Long Dog, Lone Dog winter count. And I've included for you a resource specifically for this winter count. It's for middle schoolers, but there's a lot of really good information in there. This is specifically for teachers, and so this is a really good resource too. Birch bark was common in the upper Midwest as well, where I'm from. It was used to communicate, to record events, and so on. So I'm going to stop there for just a second because this is another moment. Another moment where there's kind of a natural break. I want to talk a little bit about important historical contexts. In fact, what I have come to learn over the years are the most important ones to Native writers. In other words, these are contexts that appear over and over and over again in a novel, in a short story, in a poem, in a play, and so on. And so it's almost inevitable that an author will make reference to one of these, even if they're from a particular part of what's now the United States that was not directly impacted by it, right? These are such significant historical events that as a teacher, it's really important to know something about them. In fact, I'm going to skip ahead for just a second because I'm going to say something about boarding schools in a minute. And I read two novels this summer. One called Wandering Stars by Tommy Orange. He's a Cheyenne and Arapaho author. It's a sequel to his novel There that I'll mention later. And then A Council of Dolls by a Dakota writer named Mona Susan Power. And both of them were about a third to a half about experiences at boarding schools. And so we have a writer that I'll mention later who writes about that particular experience. And it's just about perfect for high schoolers. And so there are a lot of resources on those boarding schools. And I'm going to repeat that in just a second. So I probably shouldn't have jumped ahead, but I just wanted to emphasize that like two novels published in 2024 by two really big writers in Native American literature saw the need and had the desire to talk about that particular experience that a lot of young Native people had. So here are the contexts with some suggestions for writing, pieces of writing that are almost all available online somewhere. These are works that if you talk about removal, you can teach, or if you talk about warfare on the Great Plains, you can teach. So I've tried to give you suggestions for each topic so you can give your students the big historical context, and then you can read something about it as well and connect the context to the text. I understand from reviewing the text that this is something that the students are asked to do. I wrote down somewhere that now I can't find, but like to analyze a text within a particular context, right, is something that that you ask your students to do and that they will be tested on. So I had that in mind in this part of my presentation. So the removal era, there was the Congress passed the Removal Act in 1830. It was signed by President Andrew Jackson. It led to the large-scale removal, exile would be another way to put it, of indigenous people primarily from the Southeast to Oklahoma, though removal had already happened in various ways as the result of military incursions in New England and what used to be the Old Northwest, what's now the Midwest. So there was always removal of some kind or indigenous people, right, trying to move away from European immigrants or being driven away. You know, it happened in all kinds of ways. But in 1830, it became official federal policy to remove indigenous communities from the Southeast, Cherokees, Creeks, Muskogees, Choctaws, Chickasaws, Seminoles. And so there is, from 1836, a petition written by Cherokees and sent to Congress protesting removal. I've taught this many times in an introductory American Lit class. It teaches really well. It's an impassioned plea not to force, an impassioned plea asking the United States not to force Cherokees to leave their homeland. They were eventually removed from 1838 to 1839 in what I'm sure you all know is called the Trail of Tears. Ralph Waldo Emerson, who maybe is an author that your students will have read in other contexts, wrote a letter protesting removal to then President Martin Van Buren. It was great that he got on the record protesting it. It was a little late because it was about to start already when he wrote the letter. The warfare on the Great Plains and in the Southwest and Far West, you know, through the Civil War, you know, the Northern troops in particular were fighting on multiple fronts during the Civil War. Some of the most devastating battles or attacks on unarmed indigenous people occurred between 1861 and 1865, including in Minnesota and Colorado, among other places. And so I think it's really important to discuss this with students. I've given you one of my favorite works to teach. Simon Ortiz is from Sand Creek. Sand Creek was the site of one of the most devastating massacres in the history of the U.S. West, outside of Denver, when a militia left Denver and attacked a group of Cheyennes and Arapahoes who were at the time led by a native leader named Black Kettle. Black Kettle was flying an American flag because he had agreed to peace with the United States. And it was common for Native people in the West at this time to fly an American flag to indicate to anyone who might be interested in doing them harm that they were actually peaceful. And so this is just one selection from this book of poems that on the left-hand side of the page, Ortiz writes, usually he writes a sentence that sort of in very direct and in very direct prose sort of makes a statement about what he's then going to write a poem about. And then on the right side of the page, there's a poem. And so in some ways, Ortiz is walking readers through what he's talking about. His own experiences as a veteran, actually, and his own time spent in a VA hospital near Sand Creek for treatment of alcoholism. And so as he was being treated there, he wrote this book of poems called From Sand Creek. Of course, the title suggests a letter written from Sand Creek. In this particular poem, which I won't read because I already read part of a poem to you, um, it Simon Ortiz is trying to imagine what it was like for immigrants to the West to arrive in fear of indigenous people already living there. So it's an exercise of the imagination, trying to wrap his own mind around how it would reach the point at certain moments in the West that groups like Black Kettles would, without any provocation, be attacked. And so when he talks, Ortiz, I mean, when he writes about their children, he means the children of settlers. And in that beautiful last stanza right there, he describes them hunkered down and frightened. Why are they frightened? Because most of the print about Native people depicted them as ominous and sinister and menacing. And so, of course, the children would be afraid in that case, even if there was no cause to be afraid. So they're hunkered down and they're frightened and they're wrapped up in their quilts and they're listening. And Simon Ortiz imagines that they're hearing Arapaho words in the wind. The wind is speaking Arapaho words for pain and beauty and generations. And so that is, I think a resource for you and uh, a book of poems that would allow you to teach all of it because it's very slim and it's a cohesive whole. It tells kind of one narrative from opening a poem to final poem. But you could also teach just a couple of the poems from it, actually. And that takes us up to the assimilation era, which overlaps with Warfare on the Great Plains. So Warfare on the Great Plains goes approximately to 1890, to December 1890. And Wounded Knee, which I won't say anything more about, but that's oftentimes cited as the sort of end of warfare on the plains, even though there was still military conflict. But Wounded Knee at Pine Ridge Reservation in December of 1890. The war was costly and as much unsuccessful from the point of the U.S. as it was successful. And so in 1879, they shifted policy or started to shift policy to what came to be known as the assimilation era. And this is specifically the boarding school era that I mentioned a few minutes ago. And so the first boarding school was in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. I've given you a link to the school. They have teaching kits available. So if you follow that link, make sure you go to the teaching kits too. It gives you a look inside the first and most famous of the boarding schools. But they proliferated after the opening of Carlisle. There were boarding schools throughout the East, and then they spread throughout the West as well. And this assimilation era lasted till 1934, when the Indian Reorganization Act was passed. That didn't mean assimilation stopped. It just means that it stopped being the policy of the federal government. Gertrude Bonnen, or her pen name Zikala Shah, which means redbird in Lakota, wrote a book about her own experiences at the boarding schools called American Indian Stories. It's available online. We'll have a link for you. I'd love to talk about it next week. You can read it very quickly. Actually, it's pretty short. And perhaps that's a work that we could talk about. It's a foundational work in Native American literature. It's also a really unusual, intimate look from the perspective of a young girl about what it was like to be separated from your parents and taken on a train to the east, and to start at a school where you were forbidden to speak your native language, punished for speaking your native language, where your clothes and other belongings that marked you in a particular way, say in Bonan's case as Dakota, were taken from you and destroyed, and you were dressed in Western clothes or European clothes. And in whatever time you spent at the boarding school, coercively assimilated. The motto of Carlisle was kill the Indian and save the man. And so American Indian Stories, there's a very short story, short story, it's like 4 pages long, by Darcy McNichol called Train Time, about a group of young Native people waiting to take a train to a boarding school. And then Louise Erdrich has a poem about boarding schools called, as you can see on the screen, Indian Boarding Schools, The Runaways. So there's some resources there for you. I find this the section on Native American history that my students have the most interest in. Probably because they're students too. They know what it's like to be part of an educational system, and in part because so much of the writing about it is about really young people, too. So it can be very emotional reading as well, I would say. And yeah, I'm gonna just do this one more, and then I'm gonna pause again and see if you have any questions or comments too. Um, so a couple other historical contexts here, pieces of legislation that had really outsized impacts on Native communities. One is the 1887 Dawes Act, or General Allotment Act. Um, that we don't really have time for me to go really deep into this, but basically what it did is it broke up communally held tribal land and divided it into what are called allotments. And those allotments were then assigned to a head of family. And I'm going to put this word in quotes, the excess land was opened up to non-native settlement. So probably everyone here knows what happened in Oklahoma. You hear references to the land runs in Oklahoma. The derivation, or rather the origin of the word Sooners, right? What were the Sooners doing? They were settling on that land, right? The excess land that used to belong communally to tribal nations, and that then was divided up. Native people, this is an estimate, lost, if I remember correctly, about 1/3 of their land because of allotment. So they held, taken altogether, about 150 million acres. And by the time the allotment process was completed, they own less than 100 million acres. So there's some resources there, for you to consider later. I'll come back to the Ruth Muskrat Bronson Indians Are People Too one later. It appears as an example of a work that I think that you could teach to your students. 1934 Indian Reorganization Act. This is what is sometimes called part of the Indian New Deal. So FDR had a New Deal, right? He had one specifically for indigenous people. It was called the Indian New Deal. And Ruth Muskrat Bronson is a Cherokee writer who's writing that during this particular era, and was commenting on the politics at the time, the social and cultural context at the time. And she wrote a book called Indians Are People Too, that has really short chapters on a lot of things that were happening to Native people at this time. So she's actually would be good to talk about allotment, but also to talk about the Indian Reorganization Act as well. 1950s, termination and relocation. These are actually federal policies. On the former hand, there was an effort to terminate the relationship between the federal government and tribal nations. That was called termination. this effort was discussed in terms of liberation, the idea that it would liberate Indigenous people from the federal government. Of course, what really happened to the tribal nations that were terminated is that they were left nearly destitute and without the resources that they needed to sustain themselves as a community. Relocation then was an effort, literally, to relocate Indigenous people to cities. And so, as many of you know, most of the large cities in the United States have large Native American populations. And in part, that's a result of the relocation effort in the 50s, in which Indian centers were opened in cities like San Francisco, Denver, Minneapolis, Dallas, Chicago, and Indigenous people were encouraged, coerced, I think it's fair to say, into moving to the city, going to the Indian Center, having the people at the Indian Center help them to get a job, and then relocating, staying there. A lot of the literature that you'll see in the last quarter of the 20th century and the first quarter, or almost through the first quarter of the 21st century, is about the legacy of relocation, including the celebrated novel There by Tommy Orange, which I will mention later too. And then there's the American Indian Civil Rights Movement as well, and just some suggestions for resources. So I want to stop there before I make a shift again. Time is going really quickly, at least it is for me. So I want to take a pause. I want to see if you have any questions. Even if it's a kind of a big question that I could think about and address at the beginning of the session on Tuesday, I can make a note of it, and if I feel like it's such a big question that we wouldn't have time to talk about it, I'd still be happy to hear your thoughts. So I'm going to take a moment, drink some coffee, even though it's really late in the day, and I'll take a glance at the chat. Or I think, are they Elizabeth and Emily, are they able to jump on too and ask?
Feel free to unmute and ask question directly or put it in the chat.
One or the other works. Okay, let's see. I'm going to scroll down and see. Okay. I'm going to wait for just a second. I try not to be impatient. Do you all experience that too? Do you use film in your classes? I find it hard to find movies that are kid-friendly. PG-13 a must for our school. Oh, wow. Yes, you know what? I do. I use it a lot. I use it a lot. And I am going to give you some suggestions. I'll share them with Elizabeth and Emily so they can put them into, I think you were calling it the Google Classroom. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. Including a couple that are short enough that you can show in class, right? And that's one part of the logic of some of the selections that I've made that I think are teachable at all levels, but high school at least for all of you is, I find when I'm teaching Native American literature, it's really good to do it together. And so even though I teach novels a lot, when I'm teaching Native Lit, I always try to incorporate poetry and short films by Native filmmakers. And by short films, sometimes they're just 5 minutes, 5 minutes long. And it just, I mean, our students, were born digital, right? They've been looking at screens their whole lives, right? And so it's just a different dynamic for them. Well, at least it is for them than it is for me. But in any case, I will make some suggestions for you. I have one in mind, and I'm just going to say the name of it because it has such a great title, but I promise to include it when I send it to Elizabeth and Emily. It's called Four Wheel War Pony, and it's about skateboarders on the White Mountain Apache Reservation. It's about 12, 13 minutes long, something like that. It's available on Vimeo, if I remember correctly. And it's about Native youth culture, skateboarding in particular. It's really interesting. Multiple screens, and also a poem. So it has this literary component as well. And the filmmaker's name is Dustin Craig. It's such a great film. It's, in my experience at least, hard to get students to stop talking about it too. So that will be one that I mentioned, and then I'll try to come up with 4 or 5 other suggestions for you for ones that would work in class. Oh, yes, I can, Lisa. Let me, if I can, let's see. Yeah, I think you'll have to forgive me if I end up misspelling the name. I think the filmmaker Dustin Craig spells his first name with 2 N's at the end. And if I'm wrong, please don't tell me. Okay, just like let's overlook it, please. So there you go, Four Wheel War Pony. Maybe y'all can look it up and watch it before next week, and we can talk about it a little bit too. So, okay. Um, so, okay. Any other questions? Great. Oh, I'm looking at what Natasha has posted to documentary called The Forgotten Creeks. This is for right their own creation type stories after watching this and being exposed. That's great. That's great. I will look that up. Actually, too. That's available to anyone on YouTube. Right? You're saying, Natasha? Okay, I see you shaking your head. Okay, I'm gonna write that down too. Um, okay. So another another component of teaching native literature um, involves talking about oral traditions. And um, I mean, this is a topic all by itself. There are all kinds of different oral traditions. Some of them are religious or sacred. And it's my belief that they really shouldn't be taught, outside of the tribal community. I think you can talk about them if you know a little bit about them. Um, and then there are, and by religious or sacred, I mean they're used in religious contexts. They're used during ceremonies of some kind, healing ceremonies, for example, or other kinds of ceremonies, uh, songs and chants, and so on, that to non-native ears sounded a little bit like poetry, too. So you'll see collections of them, and they'll be positioned on the page as lines of poetry, actually, but they're not quite the same thing, as formal Western or European poetry. Um, and then there are secular stories too. The ones that, in my experience, students most like are trickster stories. Many, maybe most indigenous nations have a trickster of some kind. They're different, based on the part of the country that they're from. You can have magpie in the Pacific Northwest, for example. You could have rabbit in the Southeast. You could have spider in the Upper Midwest for the Dakotas and Lakotas, Iktomi. Or you could have coyote in a lot of the areas of the West. And so here, what I've done is just to suggested to you, and I'm going to have to turn the chat off for just a second so I can see my own slide. Oh, stop. So I've just suggested, a way to focus your students' attention on these oral traditions that are, hundreds and hundreds, maybe longer, years old. One of the most familiar ones is the Iroquois creation story, the Sky Woman story, sometimes called the woman who fell from the sky. And I've given you um, a link to the Iroquois Museum Resource and Curriculum Guide, which I think that that would be really helpful. There are all kinds of versions of this story. Um, the one that I would use as the most authoritative text is by an author named David Cusick, and I probably should have put this on that slide, so I'll add this before I send it, but because he himself was from the culture. But it occurred to me as I was trying to track down a good authoritative text for you that it would be a really interesting exercise for your students, all of them, to look for a version of it and to bring it back to your classroom to talk about because there's so many different versions. Some of them I think are distinctly not authoritative. But it would be a really good way to talk about where we get our information, where we get our knowledge, and what it should and should not count as an authoritative source when we're talking about a topic like this, or for that matter, actually any topic. And then I gave you a link to a story from the Pacific Northwest about coyote and the fish trap. This is a really common one in that part of the country. And then the aforementioned Gertrude Bon and Zitkala Shah collected trickster stories, not from her own community, her own Dakota community. Many of the stories in Old Indian Legends, also available online because it's out of copyright, are Iktomi stories. And so Iktomi was the trickster spider in her culture, in the Dakota culture. So there's some resources for you. I wish we had more time to talk about that. Someone already mentioned the Way to Rainy Mountain in the chat. Who was that mentioned who was that mentioned the Way to Rainy Mountain? Let's see, I'm trying to Barbara. Okay, thank you, Barbara, for doing that. I'm so glad that you use it. Can you very briefly in the chat tell me how it goes? I mean, it works well, it teaches well in your experience? Wait, if where is Barbara? Oh, okay. Anyway, the kids have an easy time understanding this. Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. This is a very slim work by a revered Native writer who passed away in the spring, um, right in the middle of a semester in which I was teaching Native American literature, actually. Um, but yeah, they love the Devil's Tower part. I mean, that's one of the reasons this is perfect. Yeah, I'm feeling affirmed right now, Barbara, because you're sharing that. Because the story about Devil's Tower, is so powerful about how it ended up looking like it does. Right? In the story, those are the claw marks of a bear. And so Mamade tells this story in The Way to Rainy Mountain, but he also tells a story using three different genres. And so he uses or the stories from the oral tradition, um, and then he writes in a historical uh, mode, and then he writes in a personal mode. And each one of those modes, they're very short. Barbara will know this, of course, but it's maybe a paragraph each, and he sort of takes us through at one and the same time a personal, historical, and an oral journey through Kiowa history, and that history includes um, so-called Devil's Tower as well. He's a beautiful writer. I'm so glad to hear that your kids have an easy time understanding it. It's one of those really, really rare books that I think you can teach to pretty young readers, and I teach it, to my undergraduates in upper division Native American literature classes, and it's a pretty remarkable thing. So strong recommendation from me and strong recommendation from Barbara as well. And then, and because I noticed it's about 5 minutes after 6, I'm going to just move us up to where we'll start next Tuesday. But I wanted to just, give you a view of Native American literary history. So now we're talking about Native American writing, right? So we looked at newspaper rock and the Dresden Codex and the wampum belt and the winter count, right? Like these are ways to record history, and they are creative expressions that communicate in the way the literary arts do. Um, but now I'm going to use the more conventional definition of literary and talk about the words that Native writers put onto the page. Some of these writers we will talk about again on Tuesday, quite a few of them actually. But I just wanted to give a sense of the full scope of approximately, let's see, we're at 300 years of Native American writing. It's actually longer than that, but if I was to teach a Native American literary history class, right, like one from a beginning to say Tommy Orange, um, I would start with Samson Occom, a Mohegan writer, and I would start with a short narrative of my life. Um, and then his story is just remarkable and fascinating in all kinds of ways. I mean, his biography, he shares a little bit of it in this short narrative of his life, which he published in 1768. And then William Apess, a Pequot writer, uh, and he wrote Son of the Forest and several other works, of one of which I would strongly recommend that you consider teaching, and I'll make reference to later. Um, John Rollin Ridge, Cherokee writer. Ridge is a famous family in the Cherokee Nation. Um, well, yes, a famous family in the Cherokee Nation. Let me just leave it at that. He wrote the first novel by a native writer. Uh, Interestingly enough, about Joaquin Murrieta, um, a, a Mexican or Mexican American bandit in California, published in 1854. Sarah Winnemucca, she would be really difficult to teach, I think, in a high school class. But she wrote a really wonderful autobiography called Life Among the Paiutes: Their Wrongs and Claims. If you were willing to read through it, you might be able to select sections from it. Um, Perhaps one in particular when she describes the Paiutes' first encounter with white settlers too. So she gives a report in her book on that. There's Gertrude Bonin, again, Zikala Shah, a Dakota writer. I've mentioned Old Indian legends and American Indian stories both, and I hope we get a chance to talk about American Indian stories next week. Darcy McNichol, I've mentioned him as well. I'm doing this chronologically. I hope you all realize that I probably should have said that from the beginning. I'm sort of bringing us from the early 18th century up to the 21st. But McNichol wrote a novel published in the 30s that probably isn't manageable for high schoolers, but might be. That's The Surrounded. And then he wrote a YA novel called Runner in the Sun, which is actually probably more for middle school students. And I think it would just be really fantastic for middle schoolers. There's a very inexpensive paperback of it published by the University of New Mexico Press. And it's a novel that's set prior to the arrival of the Spanish in Mexico and the Southwest. And then there's Mama Day, Kiowa writer I mentioned a moment ago, who passed away this spring. I mentioned Housemaid of Dawn because even though I don't think that you would teach it in high school, it's important to know it for two reasons. One, it won the Pulitzer Prize in 1969, and it's widely considered to be the text that launched what's called the Native American Renaissance. And so there was already a built-in audience for works by Native Americans in the late 60s and early 70s, in part because of the American Indian Civil Rights Movement. But he's often credited with drawing more attention to Native writing than any other author had previously. And so it's a justifiably famous text in Native American literary history. So is Leslie Marmon Silko's Ceremony. Both those novels are about Native World War II veterans, and they're both set in the 50s and the 60s. And then Erdrich, Louise Erdrich, who I've mentioned probably 5 times already. We started with her poem, Dear John Wayne. She is a novelist, and I just mentioned two of her most well-known novels, Tracks and Love Medicine, though she's written some that are definitely for older readers that are in your classrooms, like The Roundhouse, um, among others, and even more recently, The Sentence, which is a novel about a fictionalized account of her bookstore in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and set during the pandemic and the George Floyd protests, too. And then there's Sherman Alexie as well. And then for some reason, I left out Tommy Orange, even though I said I was going to go from Samson Occam to Tommy Orange. So this is where we're going to start on Tuesday. Here are the authors that, in my experience, are the most frequently taught. And then in the slides that follow, I make some suggestions about specific texts, most of them pretty short, some poems, some short stories, maybe 3/4 of them easily available online. And so you could access them easily and take a look at them. And so what I'll do is I'll kind of give it a little bit of thought about which ones I think you might be most interested in. But I would actually be willing to talk about any of these. I think the one in particular that I would say right now is Gertrude Bonnin's American Indian Stories. And I'll make sure that you have the link for that, even though if you Google it, it will come up for you. You don't need to wait for the link from me. So I'm going to stop there because I know that there are a couple other announcements and so on that either Elizabeth or Emily needs to make. And if anyone wants to drop a question for me to think about between now and next week into the chat, I can take a look at that while Elizabeth is talking.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Cox. What a fantastic session, and we're looking forward to next week.